Today we are going to be looking at the Sacral Monarchic ways. These are a cluster of ways that developed in Afro-Eurasia during the Bronze Age and on a somewhat different timeline in the Americas, but that are of enormous significance because of what they tell us about the nature of humanity and human aspirations. These are a cluster of civilizations that were focused on the theosis or deification of the ruler. Now, there are a number of common characteristics of these civilizations. They were very frequently, at least, for the larger scale civilizations, concentrated in river valleys, either arid or semi-arid, or in some cases in large lakes or other bodies of water that could be the source of some kind of irrigation system. They were most often based on irrigation agriculture of some kind, although we do find smaller scale societies that are similar that were not based on irrigation. They are characterized by what we call a tributary mode of production. The warlords who founded these societies have conquered a range of villages, and the surplus that's produced by the peasants is centralized by means of taxes, rents, or forced labor. The ruling class builds its power and exercises it on the basis of a combination of a monopoly on weapons technology. We see these societies emerge first and foremost with the advent of bronze metallurgy, and also by means of religious mystification, by creating a cult in which the ruler is regarded as divine or as the adopted son of the god or as in some other way sacred. And again, this is a society focused on achieving deification, usually understood as immortality, by a combination of conquest, sacrifice, and religious monumentalization, the construction of large temples and pyramids. There are a number of examples of this in the Afro-Eurasian world, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and the Huanghe Valley, or Yellow River Valley in China. Again, the earliest developments of this sort of civilization seem to be in river valleys where large-scale cooperation is necessary in order to build irrigation systems, which are effectively essential for survival in these regions. And then gradually they spread to other areas that are practicing dry soil agriculture. From a technological vantage point, we see a very close correlation between the development of bronze technology around 3000 before the Common Era and the emergence of these warlord states, which are able to use conquest and exploitation as an economic development strategy. They are also associated with the development of irrigation agriculture, which allows the farming of drier regions and thus the ability to support larger populations. We call the economic structure tributary essentially because the warlords would conquer villages which were then forced to pay tribute to them in the form of rents, taxes, or forced labor. The peasants retain control over the production process. They simply do not retain control over the surplus value that they produce. Some of this surplus, in some cases, quite a bit of it, was actually invested in public works. In the production of, again, the irrigation systems, storehouses for grain. We even see a type of welfare system where people received allotments of grain or a minimum allotment of beer or something like that. But much of it also, of course, goes to luxury consumption and to the warfare which is necessary in order to expand the wealth of the state in question. And again, of course, this is the defining feature of these societies, namely that the king is regarded as divine or as chosen by the gods. And often there is a kind of coronation ceremony or something comparable to that, which is in effect a ritual process of deification. The larger religion of these societies is characterized by the rise to prominence of warlord gods, gods of the battlefield, who are often doubled over as agricultural deities, storm gods, for example, or gods associated with particular planets. We do find, however, that mother goddesses and culture heroes continue to be prominent as well. This ritual of sacrifice is absolutely fundamental. What sacrifice does is to embody the idea that creation comes about through destruction. And that is absolutely essential for the warlords to ritually establish their superiority over the peasants. If creativity itself is foundational, then presumably the peasants would have a higher status than the warlords, because the peasants are growing food, raising animals, and the warlords are killing and destroying. And so sacrifice really brings death and destruction to the fore as a condition for the full participation in the creative cycle. And again, the aim of the process is deification in the sense of achieving immortality, although the extent to which these various societies believed that deification was fully possible varies considerably. One of the things that we know about this kind of society, the tributary mode of production, sacral monarchy, which favors warfare over productive innovations, is that it undercuts technological development. And so while there were an entire spate of technological developments, say between about 10,000 and 3,000 before the Common Era, which led to the emergence, in effect, of urban civilization, during the Bronze Age itself, innovation more or less grinds to a halt. There are a couple of critical developments, and we'll talk about some of them in a couple of minutes. But for the most part, it was a period of economic stagnation. And so what happens is that between about 1200 and 1000 before the Common Era, across most of Afro-Eurasia, large urban civilizations retreat, or in some cases collapse completely. And so we see this with the Greek Dark Ages, Greece in the Mycenaean period, the kind of mid to late Bronze Age had a kind of a civilization centered on small scale versions of this sacral monarchic model, sometimes called a palace civilization. That's the society that is depicted in the Iliad, for example, even though that's a later text. After the Trojan War, that collapses completely. Urban civilization disappears, writing disappears, and Greece basically retreats back to village level organization. In the Indus Valley, we see the collapse of a large urban civilization, probably because of ecological changes, but also quite possibly due simply to the inability to continue to support those large urban structures without exploitation. We don't see in the Indus Valley civilization the same degree of religious monumentalization. We don't see the same degree of militarization that we do in other societies, so it's less likely that there was some kind of upheaval or insurrection, but it may simply have been that the peasants decided to stop supporting it, decided to stop supporting the cities. This is also the period when we see the birth of ancient Israel. The strength of the great powers in the region, Egypt and Mesopotamia, had declined considerably Iron technology filters down from the also collapsing Hittite Empire, allows the peasants to terrace the hill country, which is out of reach of the chariots, which are the principal modality of warfare for the Canaanite warlords and their Egyptian overlords. And so we see these liberated zones developing in the hill country of Judea and Samaria and the Galilee. And then finally, in China, in the Hebei Valley, the last large Bronze Age dynasty, the Shang dynasty, is overthrown by one of the principal subject peoples, the Chao. The Chao continue a sacral monarchic pattern, but with some very significant differences. In particular, the focus on the idea of the mandate of heaven. So, yes, the emperor is indeed the son of heaven, kind of a classic sacral monarchic model, but he remains the son of heaven only insofar as he carries out the mandate of heaven, insofar as he governs justly in service to the common good. And when he ceases to do that, he ceases to be emperor. As we suggested earlier, the pattern in the Americas was somewhat different. We also see tributary social formations, sacral monarchic civilizations developing in the Americas. The timeline is a little bit different. The technology is a little bit different. The ecosystems are a little bit different. But many of the patterns are quite similar. Probably the oldest of the urban societies in the Americas was centered at Caral in what's now Peru, just north of the current capital of Lima. And this is a center of urbanization and religious monument building, pyramid building, that probably dates back to 3000 before the Common Era. So actually roughly the same timeline as similar developments in Afro-Eurasia. Although at this point it does appear to have been isolated, and the next major urban development is the Olmecs, some 1500 years later. And then, of course, the Inca and the Maya and the Aztecs and the many peoples who contributed to the development of their civilizations run much later than that and were still flourishing at the time of the Spanish conquest. The early civilizations of the Americas were much less centered on river valleys. They were often in the highlands, particularly in a what's called a subtropical highland climate, which is very mild and which has a moderate amount of rain, most of it concentrated actually in the summer. Some of them are also in tropical wet and dry or even rainforest climates, and this creates a rather different dynamic. There was more focus, therefore, on adaptation to mountain and tropical forest ecosystems than to irrigation to provide water to fields in an otherwise arid or semi-arid region. But we do see some really incredibly interesting technologies, such as the chinampas, which were built in Tenochtitlan. This is kind of the opposite of irrigation. Rather than digging ditches and bringing water to otherwise dry fields, what you're doing is building up mounds of earth in the water. You know, there's a large lake, and then growing your crops there. And if you go to Mexico, to ancient Tenochtitlan, El Distrito Federal, you can still to this day see these structures in the market at Xochimilco. Metallurgy was less developed than it was in Afro-Eurasia, although we do see some arsenic bronze in the Inca Empire, and we see metals used for decorative purposes. But most of the tools are stone. The Aztecs, for example, had highly developed stone tools made from obsidian, which is a volcanic glass. Again, underlying economic structures very similar to Afro-Eurasia. Tributary structures where dependent peasant communities support the warlords who are concentrated in the large cities. But we do see in some of these societies, again, just as we see in Afro-Eurasia, the development of centralized planning and of a kind of welfare state that seems to have been much more developed in the Inca Empire than in the Aztec or Mayan societies. We see again a similar sacral monarchic structure with the king regarded as either divine or as in some way distinctly participating in the sacred. One difference is the tendency towards dual rule. We see this with the Aztecs, who had the Tlaoni, the honorable chief speaker, who is the figure who Europeans called the king, and then the Seohoro, the snake woman, who in historical times was male, who was basically a chief priest. And this is a pattern which is probably associated with a cluster of indigenous peoples in the region, because we see a similar structure among many of the Puebloan societies that have an inside chief who is the ritual leader and the kind of the chief judge and mediator inside the community, and an outside or war chief who is focused on external relations and on warfare. Although the relative prestige is flipped. In the Puebloan societies, the inside chief has primacy. In Aztec society, the outside chief, the honorable chief speaker, had primacy. The religion of these societies, again, focused on the role of warfare, death, and destruction in the creative cycle. Again, that's not anything that is peculiar to the peoples in question. It is a function of the fact that their societies were constituted by warfare. So you see a certain amount of human sacrifice in most of these early American civilizations. In the case of the Aztecs, it was quite extensive. They believed that each world was brought into being by means of a process whereby a god would sacrifice himself by self-immolation, by burning himself on the altar, that would bring a world into being. In order to sustain that world, the god then required a steady diet of beating human hearts. Eventually, each world would fail, each world would collapse, and the Aztecs believed that we're currently in the last world, the fifth, they called it the fifth sun, and that Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, who was also called One Death, and Yaotl, enemy of both sides, would spring from the earth and destroy everything, even the gods, so that the universe, in a certain sense, was regarded as a failed experiment in creation through self-sacrifice. There are a couple of interesting issues to think about in conjunction with these sacral monarchic civilizations, which were also the first urban civilizations and the first to use writing on any significant scale. So in this context, it's worth thinking about what makes a human settlement a city, what defines a city, um, and how does city life affect what it means to be human. This is a central question for a number of traditions. As we move forward, we'll see that ancient Israel was not too keen on cities. Ancient Greece really saw the city as constitutive of what they were trying to accomplish. There are also some very significant historical sociological questions. Did cities arise exclusively through conquest and warfare, or did some cities arise as temples and sanctuaries became centers where people came together, celebrated, engaged in trade, and eventually settled down? And there's growing evidence for that second option. Another interesting question concerns writing, which emerges at roughly the same time as urbanization. Initially, these were ideographic scripts with phonetic scripts coming probably around the time of the crisis of the Late Bronze Age or during the early Iron Age. Writing obviously has profound impact on the course of human development. Most early examples of writing were not profound religious or philosophical text. That was mostly writing was mostly something that was used for record keeping, but it does then allow a type of discourse, a use of language which is different from spoken language, that probably plays a major role in the development of formalization, of the kind of formal argument we see in mathematics and philosophy. But writing also creates a permanent divide between the intelligentsia and the people, or between the kleros, or clergy, and the laos, or laity. And it closes off access to participation in the development of the constitutive stories of a people. When you have to be able to read in order to fully understand the story, when you have to be able to write in order to contribute to it, there's going to be a smaller pool of people that can participate in that. So I hope you will give some thought to these issues, and I look forward to continuing the discussion with you next week.